It was a cold spring morning, April 17th, 1936. 27 boys, full of excitement, set out on what was supposed to be an exciting hiking trip through the Black Forest in Germany. But by nightfall, a deadly snowstorm struck, trapping the boys in freezing conditions. 5 of the boys, between 12 and 14 years old, lost their lives that day. The snowstorm was relentless, and the boys were dressed in summer clothes, shorts, sandals, and no proper gear for the cold. They had no idea what was coming. Despite repeated warnings from locals about the dangerous weather ahead, the teacher leading them, Kenneth Keast, ignored the advice. As they continued through the waist-deep snow, some boys started to collapse from the cold. 2 boys made it to a farmhouse, shivering and speaking only a few words. Boys ill on mountain. By the time villagers from Hofsgrund made it up the mountain, 5 boys had already succumbed to the freezing conditions. What followed was not just a tragic loss, but a web of lies and cover-ups that kept the truth hidden for decades. The tragedy raised questions about the decisions made that day. Why had they been sent up a mountain in the middle of a snowstorm? Why wasn't anyone held responsible? The full story only came to light after 80 years. This wasn't just an accident, it could have been avoided. The day started simply enough. On April 17, 1936, 27 boys from Strand School in London were excited about their hiking trip through Germany's famous Black Forest. Led by their teacher, Kenneth Keast, the group set out on what was supposed to be an adventurous 10-day journey. The hike began early that morning from the town of Freiburg, where the boys aged 12 to 17 were staying in a youth hostel. They were set to walk about 21 kilometers to Tottenberg, a route that, under normal conditions, would have been manageable, if tiring. But there was a problem: the weather forecast. Warnings about an incoming storm were issued the day before. Keast had been informed by the local tourist office, and even the hostel workers had pointed out the bad weather. But Keast dismissed these concerns, saying the English boys were used to unpredictable weather. He didn't even have a detailed map, just a basic one with little information on the actual terrain. As they began their hike, the weather turned worse quickly. Within a few hours, snow started to fall, and what began as light sleet soon turned into a heavy storm. The boys were dressed for a spring walk, most of them in shorts, light jackets, and sandals. They had no idea they would soon be battling a snowstorm. About 3 hours into the hike, the group started to lose their way. Keast had chosen an unusual route, leading the boys off the main trail. They ended up wandering in circles, unsure of where they were. Locals had warned them not to continue, but Keast insisted on pushing forward, believing they would make it to their destination despite the worsening conditions. By the time the group reached the base of Schauinsland Mountain, snow was piling up around their feet. The boys were already tired, some complaining of the cold. But Keast believed that turning back was more dangerous than pushing on. He continued to ignore all the signs: the snow, the exhaustion of the boys, and the advice from villagers they met along the way. Each decision made their situation worse, leading them deeper into the mountains and further away from safety. By mid-afternoon, the storm had become too severe. The snow was now waist-deep in some areas, and the boys were struggling to move. At one point, they came across 2 local woodcutters, who strongly advised them to stop and head back. The woodcutters offered to show them a nearby hostel where they could take shelter, but Keast refused again. He was convinced that going back would be more dangerous. At around 3 p.m., the group finally reached the base of the steepest part of their journey, a near-vertical climb up Kapler Wand. With snow pouring down and the temperature dropping, the boys began to collapse from exhaustion. Some were barely able to keep walking, and others had to carry their weaker classmates. Despite their exhaustion, Keast believed the best way forward was to keep moving. They were only a few kilometers from the village of Hofsgrund, where they could find shelter. But in his eagerness to push on, Keast made a critical mistake. Instead of leading the boys directly toward the village, they ended up climbing further into the mountains, into even worse weather. With visibility close to zero, the group was now completely lost. By the time the sun began to set, the boys were scattered across the mountainside. They had been hiking for nearly 9 hours, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. It was getting darker and colder. The first sign of hope came when 2 boys, half frozen and barely able to walk, stumbled into a farmhouse on the outskirts of Hofsgrund. They were able to speak just enough German to say, "Boys ill on the mountain." The local villagers acted quickly. Knowing the boys were in grave danger, they formed a rescue team and headed up the mountain in the middle of the storm, hoping to find the others before it was too late. The snowstorm had grown more intense as the evening approached. The boys, scattered and exhausted, were fighting against freezing winds and deepening snow. As darkness fell, the storm was relentless, and many of the boys were no longer able to move. They had been hiking for almost 9 hours, with no sign of shelter in sight. Some of the younger boys collapsed, unable to push on any longer. Those who could still walk tried to carry their friends, but it was becoming clear that survival was slipping away with each passing minute. Meanwhile, the villagers who had heard the desperate cries from the mountain were organizing a rescue. After the two boys had made it to the farmhouse and called for help, the urgency became clear. The local men, equipped with whatever they could find, headed up the mountain in the dark. They had no time to wait for proper rescue teams. It was now or never. Time was running out, and they knew that if they didn't act fast, the boys wouldn't survive the night. As the villagers climbed, the storm made it nearly impossible to see. The path was treacherous, with snow covering everything. The boys' faint cries for help were their only guide. After hours of searching, they began finding some of the boys, half buried in snow, shivering and barely conscious. But for some, it was already too late. The freezing temperatures had taken their toll, and several boys were found lifeless, their bodies unable to withstand the cold any longer. The villagers did everything they could to save those who were still alive. They used sleds and makeshift stretchers to bring the boys down the mountain. Some had to be carried on the villagers' backs. It was a desperate, life-saving effort, and the conditions made the journey slow and perilous. The storm continued to rage as the rescuers struggled to make their way back to the village. By the time they reached safety, it was clear that the situation was grim. The local doctor had already been called and was waiting to treat the boys. He and his team worked through the night, trying to warm the boys' frozen bodies and revive those who had collapsed. But despite their best efforts, 5 boys were declared dead. The others, though suffering from severe hypothermia, were fortunate to survive. As the news spread, it shocked both the local community and the families of the boys back in London. How had a simple school hike turned into such a tragedy? Parents were heartbroken, and the community demanded answers. People began to question the decisions made that day. Why had the group been sent up the mountain in the middle of a snowstorm? Why had the warnings from locals been ignored? And most importantly, who was responsible for the deaths of these 5 young boys? Kenneth Keast, the teacher leading the hike, became the focus of much of this scrutiny. He had ignored multiple warnings from the villagers, who had urged him to turn back when the storm began. Instead, he had pushed forward, convinced that they could reach their destination. He had chosen a route that was far more dangerous than necessary, and when the storm hit, he had failed to recognize the severity of the situation. By the time he realized how serious the storm was, it was too late to go back. Keast tried to defend his actions, saying that he had done everything in his power to protect the boys. He claimed that he had no idea the storm would be so severe, and that he believed they were safer moving forward rather than turning back. But as more details came to light, it became clear that the tragedy could have been avoided. Villagers who had spoken to Keast during the hike recalled warning him of the storm's dangers, only to be ignored. The woodcutters who had offered to show the group to safety were also brushed off, with Keast insisting they continue on their planned route. Back in London, the parents of the deceased boys were devastated. They couldn't understand how such a tragedy had happened. The boys had been sent on what was supposed to be a safe, well-organized school trip. Now 5 families were left to mourn their sons, while others worried about the long-term effects the ordeal would have on the surviving boys. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the situation was even more complicated. The German authorities, aware of the growing tension between their country and Britain, were eager to avoid further controversy. They downplayed any talk of negligence or poor planning, presenting the disaster as an unavoidable act of nature. This narrative was quickly picked up by the media, both in Germany and in Britain. The story of a sudden blizzard that struck without warning, taking the lives of 5 innocent boys, became the accepted version of events. But some people weren't satisfied with this explanation. The father of one of the boys, Jack Eaton, refused to accept that the disaster was merely a natural accident. He traveled to Germany several times after the tragedy, retracing the steps of his son's final hike and speaking to locals who had been involved in the rescue. What he found convinced him that the truth was being covered up. He believed that Keast's poor decisions and the lack of preparation for the hike had directly led to the deaths of the boys. Eaton became a vocal critic of both Keast and the school, accusing them of negligence and demanding justice for his son and the other victims. But his efforts were met with resistance. Both the German and British governments were eager to move on from the incident, and any further investigation was quietly discouraged. Even the report filed by the public prosecutor in Freiburg, which contained damning evidence of Keast's mistakes, was buried, never reaching the public or the grieving families. Despite the best efforts of people like Eaton, the official story remained unchanged. The deaths were officially ruled as the result of a freak snowstorm, and no one was held responsible for the tragedy. Keast returned to Britain, where he eventually resumed his teaching career, though the memory of that fateful day in the Black Forest would haunt him for the rest of his life. For the families of the boys who died, however, the pain never truly went away. They were left with questions that would never be answered, and the knowledge that their sons had been taken from them in such a senseless, avoidable way. As the days following the tragedy unfolded, the full scale of the disaster began to sink in. The boys who survived were physically and emotionally shattered, and those who had lost their lives were mourned by their families and communities. However, as the grieving began, so did the search for answers. The parents of the deceased boys wanted to know how such a tragedy could have happened. They had sent their children on what was supposed to be a safe school trip, and now they were left with the unimaginable loss of their sons. Kenneth Keast, the teacher who led the hike, was immediately thrust into the spotlight. He gave statements to both the media and the authorities, claiming that the snowstorm was entirely unexpected and that he had done everything he could to save the boys. In the days following the tragedy, Keast was often seen in photographs, presenting himself as the heroic teacher who had fought to save his students against impossible odds. But this image of Keast as a hero didn't sit well with everyone. Locals in the Black Forest who had witnessed the events firsthand knew that Keast had made numerous poor decisions that led to the disaster. They remembered the warnings that had been ignored, the villagers who had urged Keast to turn back, and the clear signs that the weather was too dangerous to continue. Despite this, the official narrative in both Germany and Britain framed the tragedy as a natural disaster and unfortunate accident that no one could have predicted. As the German government prepared for the upcoming Berlin Olympics, they were eager to avoid any controversy that might damage relations with Britain or harm their image on the world stage. The Nazi regime quickly saw the potential to use the tragedy as a way to showcase the heroic efforts of the German people. In the weeks after the disaster, Hitler Youth members were photographed keeping vigil over the coffins of the deceased boys, and the media painted a picture of unity and friendship between Germany and Britain. Back in London, Jack Eaton, the father of one of the boys who had died, was not willing to accept the official story. He began his own investigation, traveling to Germany multiple times to retrace the steps of the doomed hike and to speak with locals who had been involved in the rescue efforts. Eaton uncovered details that directly contradicted Keast's version of events. He found that Keast had repeatedly ignored warnings and had failed to ensure that the boys were properly equipped for the hike. In his eyes, Keast's decisions had directly caused the deaths of the boys. Despite Eaton's efforts to bring the truth to light, both the British and German governments were determined to bury any criticism of Keast. In Germany, the prosecutor Eugen Weiss had written a detailed report outlining Keast's mistakes, including his refusal to take safer routes and his lack of preparation for the storm. But that report was quietly shelved, never making its way to the public. In Britain, the school and government were keen to move on from the incident, with no one willing to hold Keast accountable for his actions. For years, the official narrative remained unchanged. Keast returned to his teaching career, and the memory of the Black Forest disaster faded from the public's mind. But for the families of the 5 boys who lost their lives, the pain never went away. They were left with unanswered questions and a deep sense of injustice. Jack Eaton, in particular, continued to fight for the truth until his death. He believed that Keast had been reckless, and that the authorities had deliberately covered up the facts to protect both political interests and the reputations of those involved. It wasn't until many years later that the full truth of the Black Forest disaster began to emerge. A local German teacher named Bernd Heinmuller stumbled upon Weiss's forgotten report and the testimonies of the villagers who had tried to save the boys. Heinmuller spent years piecing together the details of the tragedy, publishing a book that finally revealed the truth behind the events of April 17, 1936.